Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the Frontline with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo is always joined by Joe Resinello. And once more, dear friends, we are going into the breach. And we want to thank you all for joining us today. And most importantly, we want to thank Captain George Phillips for joining us today because we're going to be talking about a great man today, Father Vincent Capodanno. And we're going to get into the whole thing, but Father Vincent is a great example of Christian self-sacrifice, and you'll find out why in a couple minutes. Just to give a little background, by the way, very quickly on Captain Phillips, he's personal decorations and awards. He was awarded the Legion of Merit, Meritorious Service Medal, 2 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, Combat Action Ribbon, Good Conduct Medal with 1 star, and the Distinguished Civilian Service Award. Needless to say, Captain Phillips, thank you for your service. I really appreciate it. A little background very quickly on Father Vincent Capodanno, one of 10 children raised by Italian-American parents in Staten Island, New York. He went to Fordham University and was ordained a Maryknoll priest and served in Taiwan and Hong Kong. He volunteered for the Marines and served as a chaplain in Vietnam, and he received the Medal of Honor. He was declared a servant of God by the Catholic Church. And with that background, I'm going to kick it over to you, Joe Resinello, and we'll get the interview started. Oh, and by the way, everybody watching the interview, please make sure, and we're going to give, Captain, you'll be able to give any contact information at any time you want. But follow us on Facebook at The Frontline with Joe and Joe, and please follow us on YouTube at the same, The Frontline with Joe and Joe.
Okay, we're going to begin with the prayer because all good things start with the prayer, and this is a good thing. Name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen.
Amen.
Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. With thou, Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits that prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls, amen. Captain Phillips, as Joe said, it's an honor to talk to you about Father Vincent Capodanno. I think it's providential. I read a book about him a number of years ago. Joe and I are on the radio in Louisiana. Ironically enough, 2 guys from New Jersey are being broadcasted out of Louisiana, yeah. and they mentioned him. And I said, you know, it was kind of weird that I was listening at that time. So I reached out to you, and lo and behold, here you are. I think a good place to start is, as Joe said, you served in Vietnam. You knew Father Vincent. Could you just give us a brief, explanation from a personal perspective on how he impacted your life personally, as well as how he was like as a man when you served with him?
He was the most unique person that I've ever met in my life. He had the ability to draw people in. Whenever you met him, or whenever he walked around the company site, he always drew crowds. He was very personable. Some of them have said, he was very good looking. I never really comment on that, but he was in one way the boy from Staten Island. He liked to smoke cigarettes. Actually, it was like a chimney. And he always had cigarettes to hand out to the troops. It was easy to see when you first met him that there was something special about this priest. I gave a presentation, I believe it was in St. Rose's in Staten Island, where he used to go to Mass. And after Mass, a number of the old people, not that I'm so young anymore, but some of the people that were older than me, they came up to me and said, we knew Vincent, we knew Vin, and they were telling me stories. But they all said that, because there was about 4 of them standing around, that even as a kid, they knew that there was something special about him. And in Vietnam, it was the same way. Whether you talk to people from 7th Marines or 5th Marines, it's always the same. And I'll talk about his eyes later on.
The book that I read was entitled The Grunt Padre, and that was sort of the reputation that he developed amongst the Marines. Could you explain why they called him the Grunt Padre?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was written by my friend, Father Mode. That actually, I would just tell you, that book started out as a thesis in his diaconate year. And he interviewed me for that book, along with many, many others. But after he finished the thesis and he turned it in, they said, "You better turn this into a book." But it was that book that really started to generate interest in Father Capodanno. In the Marine Corps, if you're a what we call O3s, that's infantry. And, we feel we're the kings of the Corps. Everybody else is just there to, to support us, which is actually still true. But they would call us grunts because we were down on the ground walking all the time. And when Father Capodanno showed up in 1-7, most chaplains, matter of fact, in my career, my combat career, I never saw a chaplain leave the rear area. He, most chaplains just, sat in the back, and they give you a blessing on the way out sometimes, or, but they were usually up at the CP, and, they would hold, their services, whatever they might be, because we had chaplains in all denominations. But Father Capodanno was different. When troops were going outside the wire, he would go with them, and he would go on the patrols with them day and night. And most of us, we walked in a tactical manner. He was going up and down the lines, up and down the patrol, always talking to people. And so if we put in 10 miles, he probably put in 20, going up and down. But none of us, and I know the guy, was a bunch of the guys from 1-7. We'll talk about one of them later on, I think. But I had never, and I had been in Vietnam that time, by this time, 9 months. And I had never seen a chaplain go outside the wire, and I don't want I don't want people to understand that going outside the wire was just going for a walk. Basically what we did in Vietnam in the early years, 66, 67, we primarily walked around until somebody shot at us. And that's how the firefight started. And sometimes they escalated into pretty big things, like they did on 4th September. So he was putting his life on the line with the people that he served. And that was very unique and very much appreciated by the Marines. And I'm not talking about just the Catholic Marines. He became friends to everybody.
Well, I could say this. I've actually been to Vietnam. I backpacked through Vietnam and Cambodia, and I went through the Mekong Delta. It is hot as the day is long. So when you talk about walking 20 miles in heat, like that would rot your boots probably off your feet. I just want to give our listeners some idea of, because I didn't serve in the military, but I did go to that region of the world, and the heat is unbelievable. So it's not a pleasant walk, is all I'm trying to say. I'm sure it wasn't.
You either walk in the heat and the humidity, or you walk in the monsoon, which is constant rain with extremely high humidity. So you were never really dry in Vietnam. You would sleep wet, and you get up in the morning and your clothes aren't dry, and you're off you go. That's just the way it was. But you're right. The heat and the humidity, I've never forgotten.
I heard you say in an interview that his eyes look through you. I personally know a priest who met Mother Teresa. This particular priest, as a young man, left the seminary. He became a medical doctor. And he said when he met Mother Teresa, she looked through him as a result of other encounters with a very good Jesuit, Father John Hart. And he left his medical practice and went back. But he talked about that encounter, that the saint, when she looked at him, she looked through him. And I heard you say that. I'd like to expand on that. In that same talk, you said he was a great listener and that he never turned anyone away. Could you just talk a little bit about that aspect of his personality?
Yeah. When you were one-on-one with him, which virtually everybody in the company got to do at one time or another, but when you were one-on-one with him, and I have been on one-on-one with him on several occasions. I don't know how many, but when you stood close to him, like within about 2 feet, not 6 feet like we do right now, but 2 feet or so, normal conversational distance. And you looked up into his eyes. His eyes were amazing. There was always compassion and a love of the guy who he was talking to. But he also, and this is going to sound strange, and I don't care, but it's the way it was. You would talk to him, and there might be a bunch of stuff going on. People playing, football, or we didn't do very much of that. But it could have been a football, or there could have been a firefight out in the distance, or somebody on the lines firing at something that got their attention beyond the wire. And you weren't really conscious of it because the comfort and the feeling of well-being and the feeling of being cared for and loved that would come through his eyes, plus his whole demeanor. It was like you're in the cone of silence, if you remember the old days. And you would just talk, and he would never break off the conversations. But when I would say, for example, Father, I have to go, and he said, fine, no. But I'll tell you, that feeling stayed with you for a long, long time. And every time you met him, it got stronger and stronger. And it gave, I can speak to myself, other Marines have told me basically the same thing, but it gave you, even after you walked away, such a feeling of well-being that it lifted your spirits. And I got to believe that he understood to some extent what kind of effect he had on people. And I think that's one of the reasons he was sought out by so many Marines. It's one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had in my life.
You said he was a very different kind of chaplain. Did he influence other chaplains in the military?
I know of one. We made the about 3 years ago, over a period of a year and a half, we made a DVD about his life. It's named Called and Chosen. And through the process, one of the Episcopal chaplains became involved with the production, Father Krulak, and he was an Episcopal, but he says in the movie, and I had met him, and I know both I know his brothers. One of them actually became Commandant of the Marine Corps. And in the interview, he talks about Father Capodanno in the most glowing terms. But the interview asked him, what was his effect? He said, well, everybody needs support, and everybody needs a mentor. He said, so when I was confused or needed help, Father Vincent was my mentor, and he was the best mentor anybody ever could have had. And I know Father Krulak, and he is strong, outspoken, very dedicated priest in the Episcopal Church. So that's very high praise coming from him.
I believe you. People like that have a deep effect on people. I could think of a few people who have influenced my life, and that example is never forgotten. I want to switch gears a moment, and I want you to talk a little bit about Operation Swift. I know that this was an incredible battle. It affected many lives. It altered many lives. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Okay, I'll just give you the overview, and I think we'll talk later on in a little more detail, maybe. This was 1967 September. The in-country elections had just been completed. And so all the units were all spread out in the villages to make sure the elections weren't interfered with, so they could replace one dictator with another. I didn't figure that out, but and after the elections, the units started to pull back. So my company 3-5, we were up on Hill 63, which is just south of Da Nang. The other companies in 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines were likewise stationed, around. And in the 1st Battalion, I had companies A, B, and D were the ones that got in trouble. But at that time, we didn't know it, but looking back, the NVA was moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, starting to position people for the Tet Offensive in January '68. And, we noticed on the patrols, we noticed on the ambushes, the listening posts, a lot more activity. We were getting fired at a lot more than we had. We were firing back a lot more than we had. And we got into some pretty good skirmishes, but no real battles. But we could tell that this is in August, that they were becoming more and more frequent. So, even an idiot like me figured something's changing here. And so that's what they were doing. They were positioning us. And we were in the Quay Son Valley, which is really the breadbasket for Central Vietnam. And it used to feed North Vietnam. And they were very anxious to get that back. And we have been fighting them there for 9 months until the 4th. On the morning of the 3rd, Alpha Company got into a firefight with NVA. Let me make a distinction here. you've heard about the Viet Cong.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, that was like kind of like a vigilante. They were formal. They got some training from the NBA, but generally, you know, they weren't worth a crap as fighters. I mean, they could kill you, but they weren't organized fighters. The NBA, the North Vietnam Army, they were as good as any fighting force in the world at the time. They could take mortars and just walk them to your position. They knew how to run ambushes. You know, they knew how to patrol. They knew how to camouflage. So if you came in contact with the NBA, you knew it was going to be a long day. So 1-5 was crossing a river, and they got ambushed by 1-5 by the NBA. The NBA began to overrun them. They called for help, and 1-5, the regimental commander sent 2 other companies in. That was all he had, and they all got in trouble. So there were only 2 companies left in 5th Marine Regiment that were available, and that was Mike and Kilo. So early on the morning of the 4th, you know, late at night, Company Commander J.D. Murray, who is one of the nation's heroes, Distinguished Service Cross, and a good friend. And JD called all the platoon leaders up to the CP. Father Capodanno, while he wasn't part of the combat troops, he would show up uninvited usually, and just to find out one thing: what time were they leaving? Because he wanted to be on the helicopters, and so they got their assignments. Platoon commanders came back down to the troops, like myself, and said, "This is going to be bad. Take lots of ammo, lots of machine gun ammo, like double your load." And we all hated saying that, hearing that, because one, that meant we had to carry a lot more weight, but worse, they had a real good sense that we were going into something bad. So about 7, 8 in the morning, we're down in the LZ. Father Capodanno was there handing out, he used to hand out St. Christopher medals. And the troops used to love to get them, and many of us still have them. About one of the last, and it wasn't only Catholics, he'd give them to non-Catholics, you know, would go to him just as the Catholics did. Whatever, you know, if he was giving away bananas, they would have lined up for bananas, you know, just because they were coming from him. But, and he always had cigarettes, you know, so, you know, if you have a lot, none of us smoked. Well, I didn't smoke at the time, but a lot of them did, just to pass the time. And so Father Capodanno always had cigarettes. He had families from New Jersey sending him all the stuff he wanted for his Marines, and that was a pretty good logistic setup he had engineered. So he was always handing out cigarettes, and but as the birds, the helicopters started coming in, the last guy to go for a St. Christopher medal father was out. He didn't have any more. And I happened to be standing there, and I saw him take his own St. Christopher medal off and give it to that Marine. And I know that Marine, and he still has that medal. So the helicopters start to come in. I was in first platoon as a squad leader for weapons, and the helicopters start to come in. We start loading them up. First platoon, second platoon, headquarters, third platoon. First platoon goes first. We're going to take point. Second platoon's going to be on the right. Third platoon's going to be on the left. We're going to move in a wedge once we land. If you would look back at the LZ out of the last helicopter, where there had been a priest standing when the helicopters came in, when the helicopters were gone, Father Capodanno was nowhere to be seen because he was on the last chopper of third platoon, because at that point, nobody could stop him. There was nobody left in the LZ to tell him he couldn't go. And actually, the battalion commander tried to tell him he couldn't go, and he went over his head to division to get permission to go, and he did. The helicopters took off. We started flying for about 20 minutes into the LZ. But the LZ was so hot, so much firepower coming up from the ground. I mean, you're sitting in the helicopters watching holes in the floor materialize from machine guns shooting at the birds. So we went to an alternate landing spot, and we got there, and we started a walk. And I'll, if you want, I can pick up what from there to when he was killed now, or I can do it later on.
Just keep going. Keep going.
So we landed in the LZ, this alternate LZ, but it wasn't really the alternate LZ. They put us down 1,000 meters from where we're supposed to be, which is not unusual. And so we start walking, and we walked for about an hour and a half. And I was in the first platoon, and I was about the fourth guy in line. And we had a point man, a guy behind him, squad leader for the infantry, and then myself, who had weapons. And we crossed over a knoll, small hill, what we now call the knoll. In the middle of this knoll was a massive bomb crater. So somebody had dropped a 2,000-pounder, and that's where it happened to land. So we start walking over the hill, first platoon. As we start down, what we would call, the face of the hill, the point man, Jack Swan, yelled back and said, "I think I just saw a bush move." And the squad leader yelled back, "If it moves again, shoot it." So about a minute later, we hear a burst of automatic coming from up front. And so you didn't even have time to think about that Swanee had fired at that booth, because once those shots were fired, everything opened up. Everything. I mean, I had been in firefights and battles for 9 months up until this point, and some of them were pretty bad. Union 1, Union 2, DeSoto. These were all some of the biggest battles of Vietnam. And but I had never experienced, and the other guys would tell you, if you watch the movie, you would, if you watch the DVD, you would know. But the fire was so thick and so heavy that you really couldn't move. And remember, now you're on this hill, and there is some shrubbery, and there are some, little places where you could get in, but at the same time, you had to fight your way out of it, because if you didn't fight your way out of it, they'd overrun you. And so we all started firing back, and they got the command group into the crater, and things just got worse and worse. But in the middle of all this foolishness, Father Capodanno had walked from 3rd Platoon up to 2nd Platoon, and was moving into 1st, when the fire got real heavy. He immediately started going down the hill to help with the wounded and the dying. He saved several lives there. Lovejoy, I think we'll talk about later on, but just pulling people back into the CP, but really working on the wounded Marines and the dying Marines, giving them last rites. He used to say to everybody, "Fear not, God is with us today." And he would say that to us all the time. I remember thinking in the middle of this, "Fear not," and I remember thinking, how can you not be a little afraid of this? But I remembered that, and talking to the others, a bunch of others that survived, they all did too. But Father Capodanno, for hours, went up and down that hill. It's now maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Firefight started at about 11:30. So around noon, 1 o'clock is when Father Capodanno starts going up and down the knoll, ministering to people. The corpsmen, for example, Navy corpsmen, when they're treating people, they're trained to lay alongside them when they treat them, so they're not giving a higher profile and be more likely to be shot. But Father Capodanno, and this is how I know, or at least I'm convinced, that he knew the effect his eyes had on people, because he would go up to the wounded Marine or the Navy corpsman, and he would get up on one knee and look right in their eyes and look what was happening. And I know that was bringing them a tremendous amount of comfort, because that's what happened to everybody who got staring into his eyes. And he had a bag with him. It was a corpsman's medical bag. And so he would try to fix people up as best he could, and then drag them back into the CP. The CP was deep enough that the command group was up top, and they were laying body bags on one side and the wounded on the other side. And this continued, seemed like for days, but about 2 o'clock, he was running down the hill to minister to Marines, and he got stitched by a rifle or a 50 cal. Not bad. Lost a couple of fingers on his right hand. Got wounded up in his shoulder by a mortar later on. But I would imagine that frustrated him, because to a priest, his right hand is everything. That's how he makes the sign of the cross, how he does uh, everything with the host. And so I imagine that frustrated him pretty much. He didn't even bandage it. He just ignored it. Same thing with the shoulder. He ignored it and continued to go. Now, eventually bumped into a corpsman who made him put a bandage on. Some of this I know firsthand. Some of it, obviously, I know from talking to others. In particular, when we made the DVD, which is like an hour and a half full-time movie, we talked to hundreds of people who knew. Around 4 o'clock, things were really going bad. You know, the NVA they had, I don't know how many 50 cal machine guns. They had a load of troops. They even had anti-aircraft guns, and I've never seen the enemy with anything that heavy in Vietnam. Never did before, and never did after. But Father Capodanno was down towards the bottom of the hill, and there was a clearing, and there were Marines on one side, Marines on the other, and there were 2 wounded Marines on the right-hand side. One was a corpsman, and one was a Marine. And the corpsman was badly wounded. The Marine was trying to attend to him. Anyway, Father Capodanno saw, you know, I think the Marine got killed, and then the corpsman was there alone. But they were Fred Tanky and some of the guys that were right there yelled at Father Capodanno not to cross that open space, that everybody who crossed that open space got shot. You know, it was a killing zone. It was a predetermined killing zone for the NVA. They had it all spotted. Machine guns were in there. But he decided to go help the corpsman. You know, he said, look, this is what I'm here for. And off he went to the corpsman. And while he was attending the corpsman, the 50 cal picked him up and put 29 shots in him. You know, for those of you who don't know how strong a 50 cal is, if you were to stand in a field and hold your hand out, and a 50 cal hit you from 800 yards away and hit your hand, it would take you to the ground. And it would probably take your hand right off. So, I mean, nobody survives, you know, that kind of injury. And there were lots of other things going on then. And so Father Capodanno laid there dead, without any weapons, of course, with the corpsman. The battle continued to rage until about 10 o'clock at night. Now, some of us who had been wounded, like I had been wounded in a leg, but were still mobile, what we started doing was going down the hill and bringing up anybody we could find, dead, wounded, and bring them back up. Turns out that I'm told, I don't remember, that I was one of the ones that brought Father Capodanno up. But, you know, we would throw them in ponchos. And so and it was pitch black. You really couldn't see what you were doing other than, you know, the bodies. You could see it, you know, if you were looking. And there were a lot of bodies. But as we got up to the CP, and it's told to me by another guy who was up there, because I don't remember, that J.D. Murray, who was the company commander, saw something shiny under the poncho. And so he opened it up and just pulled it back, and he saw it was Father Capodanno, you know, the Padre. and nobody called him Father Capodanno. Everybody called him Padre. And so we had the wounded over here, the dead over here, but Father Capodanno was set aside separately. And JD is not a Catholic, but but he recognized the significance of the death of Father Capodanno, and he knew how special he was. He and I have talked these things over for hours. So you have to report these, and as he went on, and he'll tell you, well, if he was here, that he went on the radio, because you have to report casualties. And he went on the radio and said, one Navy lieutenant, KIA. Well, there was only one officer in the Navy that would ever be there, and that is a chaplain. So they came back immediately on the radio and said, reconfirm, reconfirm. And so he went back and said it again. And that set off a firestorm all the way up to the commanding general. And, they wanted to get him out immediately, but there was still too much shooting going on. But the next morning, the choppers came in. And when we got back to the rear, the word had started to pass during the night that the Grunt Padre was dead. And it went all over 1st Marine Division. The corpsman over the Henry Hernandez over in 1-7, they heard about it, and people were just breaking down in tears. It went across the division so fast. I mean, like in 24 hours, anybody you met knew that the Grunt Padre. I got flown out to the Repos, which was a hospital ship, much like you see in New York Harbor. And they knew out there, and they had heard of him. So when they found out that he was dead, they actually had a memorial service out there. Back in the rear, Father Krulak, with his mentor now dead, asked to be in charge of the memorial service. Now, we don't normally have memorial services. When Marines die out there, we treat them with a lot of respect. And we handle the bodies as if they're still alive. And they get flown back to the morgue at Da Nang. When his body went back to the morgue, not Henry Hernandez, the name will come to me. Wait a minute, I have it right here. Leo Rosetta was a corpsman up there, and Leo knew Father Capodanno very, very well, and it was his job to go through and identify, and he said he couldn't do it. He absolutely, he couldn't open the body bag and see Father the way he was, because he was a mess, and so he got other people to do it. And every time he talks about that, a lot of us get upset. For the memorial service, I had only been to one once before in February. I don't know who got killed, but so they had a memorial service, and I didn't know who it was, so I didn't go. But they may have had like 20 people there. Well, Father Krulak went to the battalion commander and said, how many trucks? Tell me how many people are coming, and I'll get the trucks. Well, it turns out they had over 400 people showed up for the memorial service. And that's unheard of. It's also unheard of that a battalion commander would allow that many people in one spot. Because, I mean, that's a big, big target. You know, I mean, you get 4 or 5 mortars landing in there and you'll take out every one of those 4. But for Father Capodanno, nobody seemed to care about their own safety. They just wanted to be at the memorial service. I didn't get to go because I was flown out. And shortly after he got to the morgue, you know, the family was advised and the body was flown home. And that's kind of the story of how that day went. I mean,
could you, for the benefit of our listeners, could you give them an idea of how you guys were outnumbered? I heard you say in an interview, you broke down the numbers of the North Vietnamese Army versus the Marines on the ground. I think it'll paint a very, very clear picture as far as what you guys were up against.
Yeah, I can. After the battle, you know, they did a bunch of assessments, and turns out that we had about 170 people there that day. The NVA had 2,500. They had a full, I forget whether it was a regiment or a division. And in the books, it says we defeated it. If you go to the Marine Corps Historical Society, or you read the 3 or 4 books that have been written besides the Grunt Padre, it looks like, you know, we fought with about 2,500 NVA. Turns out that was one of the biggest battles in Vietnam. Casualties were high. The wounded were very high. I mean, that day alone, besides Father Capodanno's Medal of Honor, there was another Medal of Honor. Company commander got the Distinguished Service Cross, and there were several Silver Stars, Bronze Stars. I mean, just the decorations alone would tell you that something special or something significant had happened that day. It's hard to remember, but 2,500 people in 178, that's not a fair fight. They needed at least 4,500 if they were going to have a chance.
Nice. I love it. Captain Phillips, you mentioned a few names during the course of that battle. I'd like to bring our listeners into those encounters because I think they're very significant. I think we could start out with Henry from San Antonio. I believe he was tasked with being his assistant in the field. And I recalled hearing in an interview how he would always get into trouble because he was not like an officer and he was always trying to stop him, Father Vincent, from going places, and he wouldn't listen to him. And then he would get heat from his commanders. Could you just talk a little bit about that exchange?
Yeah, sure. Henry Hernandez is a very, very good friend of mine. And I've known him, well, since Vietnam. And there's a lot of stories that go around that he knew Father Capodanno better than most, because he ultimately became the chaplain's assistant. And so the chaplain's assistant is in the rear, you keep the records, you do that stuff. And that's what they did. That's why a number of them wanted to be the chaplain's assistant, because you didn't go out on patrol, you know, you didn't go outside the wire, and, you know, it was a 9-to-5 job, and relatively safe. Well, he got, when Father Capodanno came, and this was after Hernandez had gone to confession with him, and they had other conversations. Henry asked if he could be his chaplain's assistant, and the Padre told him, he said, if you want, but he said, you're not going to be sitting behind that desk. And Henry didn't quite know exactly what he meant by that. I mean, he had an idea, but this was in 17, in the first year that Father was there. So there's a unit, maybe a platoon going out on patrol. And Father says to Henry, grab your rifle, grab your gear. We're going with the patrol. And Henry said something like, we don't do that. And he said, well, you do now. And off they went outside the wire. And when he came back, the first sergeant said to him, why'd you let him go outside the wire? Don't you know he has to stay back? If anything happens to him, we're in a shitload of trouble. I'm sorry. We're in a lot of trouble. So you don't let him go anyplace. And Hernandez remembers telling him, he doesn't listen to anybody. He just does what he thinks he needs to do. He said, I'll try to keep him back. And I think the first said something about, if you get him shot, I'll shoot you. And so off they went. But he and Henry became great friends. And,
you mentioned in the course of the battle the name Leo Rosetta. I could recall, I think it was memorialized in the film, that he was having some difficulties in Vietnam, and how Capodanno helped him to stay in the Marines. They wanted to ship him out, and he didn't want to go. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. First of all, Leo wasn't a Marine. He was a corpsman.
Okay, I'm sorry.
All right, but we treated the corpsmen as Marines. They're actually more valuable in some cases because they could do things we couldn't do. And he had been with 17. He had been on. He had been there for 13 months. In the infantry, a grunt, and he had extended for a year. And he was about 3 months from the end of that second tour when it all just got to him. Too many deaths, too many wounded. You get to a point where you've seen so much, you just really don't want to see it anymore. And I mean, Leo would shake, and well, all of us did at one point or another. But at that point, this is 1967, they didn't know what PTSD was. They didn't figure that out for years. Almost all the infantry guys coming back from Vietnam had some level of PTSD, but none of us knew it. We would just do crazy things and people would look at us. Anyway, he had PSD. They were calling it something else. And so he had to go see the psych on numerous occasions. And the psych says, look, you can't function anymore. You can't handle it anymore, Leo, I'm going to send you home. Well, everybody in the world knows it was a 13-month tour. If you get sent home early, he was afraid that it would put a stigma on him, that he wasn't strong enough to complete the second tour. Wouldn't mean anything to civilians, but it means a lot to Marines. So he bumped into Father Capodanno one day. He was sitting on a porch, kind of crying a little bit. And anyway, he told Father his predicament, and he told Father, I'm not going home. they can order me out of here, but I'm not going. And so he had been in 1-7. He said, if I can get up to First Med, which was like the big hospital, he said, if I can get up there for 3 months, I can finish my tour. And this is a short version of several meetings and several conversations. Father Capodanno finally said, let me see what I could do. And about 2 days later, Leo was transferred up to 1 Med. He finished his tour. And I'd see him periodically. When we were making the movie, he heard about it. And he came walking into my office one day and wanted to tell me the story. And, wanted to know, could he be part of the movie, because he wanted people to know how wonderful Father Capodanno was. And so, yeah, I said, sure, Joe, you're in. Yeah. Or Leo. That was Leo, yeah. And,
You also mentioned, I'm sorry.
Also, there was another gentleman, Steve Lovejoy, radio operator, I believe. Father Vincent saved his life. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the companies, the company command group traveled with 3 or 4 different radio, facts for the aircraft, artillery, all of that stuff. So we could talk to any of the supporting arms. And, but each platoon also had a radio, so we could talk amongst ourselves and talk to the commanding officer. And these were tactical radios. They're very heavy. And Steve lives out in California, Southern California now, and is another fantastic guy. But he had gotten wounded, and he was down the hill, and he had the radio, and he was trying to radio for help, and because he couldn't move and there wasn't anybody else around him. And he said, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes this big guy, because Father Capodanno was, he was 6'3", but he was, not heavy. Well, none of us there were heavy after a couple of months. But, and he said this guy just grabbed him and grabbed his radio and dragged him up into cover. And when he looked, he saw it was Father Capodanno. Now, the other thing that happened up there was that day and that night, we used every piece of support weapons that we could. One of the ones that JD called in was gas. He did it a couple of times. But the North Vietnamese were terrified of the gas. They thought it would kill them. And so they used to back off when they would see the gas. And Father Capodanno, when he got Steve up undercover, he was looking for his gas mask. Well, he didn't have it. So Father Capodanno gave him his, made him keep it on, and told him to stay there. They would come and take him to the CP, and he was off again. Steve to this day will say, if it wasn't for him, I'd be dead. And that's the kind of things he did. He it's incomprehensible to people when you tell them how any man, but especially a chaplain, would risk his life so many times for other people. The Father Capodanno read a book, The Radiating Christ, and in a few words, Radiating Christ teaches that you've got to empty yourself of yourself to make room for God. And that means doing for others all the things that we in the Catholic Church believe in. And he did that. I mean, I'm convinced, I'm convinced that he was able to empty himself out completely and just make room for God, because he was a saint.
Oh, I would agree, 100%. I mean, a great man in the Bible also did something similar. It was John the Baptist. He said, I must decrease and he must increase. And
Right.
That's exactly what that man did. You know, Henry said something in an interview that I thought was very telling, and then I want to direct it to you. He said he was having trouble going to confession, and he said it was the greatest confession he ever had when he spoke with Father Capodanno, and he credits Father Capodanno for saving his soul. How has he helped you as a Catholic? I know, Captain Phillips, you're a Catholic. I'm a Catholic, so is Joe P. How has his example, because you witnessed the example of, if you ask me, a saint, how has that influenced your life after Vietnam as a Catholic man, a father, and a husband?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I would say is that after Father Capodanno got killed, I started to pray to him that day because, and I don't know how much of this was done thinking through, but but I felt the need to pray to him, and through the years, I've continued to pray to him, and my wife and I, in raising our children, because Kathy, obviously, when she met me after Vietnam, well, we were going to get married before Vietnam, and we figured, you better wait just in case things don't go well. So, but she knew Father Capodanno very well from everything that I had told her, and so in the back of your head when you're going through life, the lessons that we'll learn from somebody like Father Capodanno, it kind of infuses your life. Now, in my case, many times, I failed, to do the kind of things he would do, but other times I did, and kind of changed my life a lot, because I knew after years of praying with him, or praying to him, I guess, or through him is actually what the Catholic Church likes to hear you say. It just kind of takes over, how you do things. And then I started meeting about 10 years ago. Jack had pulled a bunch of people together for a reunion. I guess we had about 40 or so, I don't know. And everybody, we talked about a lot of things, but everybody talked about Father Capodanno. You couldn't get into a group conversation about, about anything, this firefight, that firefight, without somebody bringing up Father Capodanno. And it's interesting because he was only with us for about 7 weeks, and yet he had a tremendous impact on everybody. And of course, when the Father Capodanno cause for canonization was approved, I was living in DC at the time, and anyway, I got asked to be the chairman, and so I become so much involved now, and I've learned so much more about him that I didn't know back then. It's just reinforced everything that I believe, and I think he's been a strong influence on my life. Although I didn't do so well, but I know he was trying with me. So
Yeah, we're all a work in progress, Captain. We'll get there.
How you mentioned the canonization process? How is that moving along, Captain?
Very well. The in 2005, the cause for canonization was approved, and Father Vincent was declared a servant of God.
Awesome.
It moved very slowly because you have to set up a tribunal. There's a whole bunch of structure that goes behind these things, and so things had to get formed up. And the last thing that got formed up was the Guild about 7 or 8 years ago. I don't know whether I had a note here that said that, but about 7, 8, maybe 9 years ago, and I ended up being the chairman. Mary Priest, who is the vice postulator, the postulators in Rome, she's been a godsend. She's been in this from the beginning, and she manages the postulator over in Italy with his happy little band of minions. It's very expensive, but it's going along well. We spent 2 years taking 2 priests and a Monsignor, 2 Monsignors and a priest, and the priest was the notary, because they would do all the statements right there, and then they get notarized and witnessed. And that took about 2 years. And then the Archbishop has to go through all that, well, through, the people that work with him, to go through and make sure that there's, and of course, the Monsignors and others, to make sure that there's nothing in there that would bring discredit upon the church. We gathered up everything he had ever written that we could find. We got all his letters home from Taiwan and Hong Kong and Vietnam, and they are actually, the letters are amazing in themselves, and they give you greater insight into just how holy this man was. But in 2 years ago, we finally had what they call the Acts. And the Acts is crates and crates and crates of all the information that we had gathered. The Acts go to Rome, delivered by Archbishop Broglio. And the Acts then go to the postulator and the cause for saints. And they all begin to review them. The postulator has to write what they call a posit, which is a document that takes into account everything that was there and puts forth from that the case for canonization. The posit is complete. It's been given, or it will be given in the next several weeks to the cause for the saints. And our hope is that shortly thereafter, he will be designated venerable, and that brings him to the next step. I have no doubt in my mind he's gonna move to that step. One of the things that's helping us is, if you remember, about 18 months ago, Pope Francis authorized another criteria for saints, priests that give up their lives for others. That's my layman's term. And so we have moved him into that category. And, you know, based on what you all know about Father Capodanno and what I know about Father Capodanno, there couldn't be a better fit for the definition that Pope Francis put out, which, you know, I just referred to, but I don't remember it exactly, but I know he fits.
Captain, are there any miracles that are attributed to Father Capodanno?
And miracles are a funny thing. They don't like us talking about miracles, but let me do two things. I'll say we are aware, the people that work on the tribunal, and not all the board members, but we are aware of several that we will eventually send to Rome, although we did indicate that they were there. But last year, or I guess 2018, a woman in Florida, I think Florida, give me a second. Yeah, here it is. I know I'm 73, so I don't remember all of this stuff. Like,
all good.
Yeah, like I used to. But in Florida, she prayed to Father. This woman had MS. She prayed to Father Capodanno. They say almost endlessly. It was advanced. You know, she was losing the ability to take care of herself, and you know that's a very debilitating disease. And then one day she woke up and felt great, and so she went to the doctors, and they did the head X-rays, whatever they do. They couldn't find any lesions at all. The lesions had all disappeared. And so, you know, when we went back, you know, to verify, now, you know, of course, when we heard about this, the Archbishop down there, you know, did a regular inquiry by the book. And the conclusion of the doctors and the others was that there is no medical reason that this should have happened. She should have continued along and been dead in about 6 months. It turns out one of the priests is an atheist, which we think will help the case, you know, because he's probably an idiot, but
one of the doctors.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You said one of the priests. I was like.
Oh, okay. Yeah, one of the doctors.
One of the doctors.
Yeah, was an atheist. So, and that's been reported to Rome. We sent that on about, actually, the Archbishop down there sent it on about, I want to say 2 months ago. So that is the first fully verified miracle. And you don't even need that to be declared venerable. So he, like I said to Mary Priest, maybe they'll get the miracle and maybe they'll jump him a few steps, you know, and you know, move him up to blessed. But if not, we're, you know, it's a long haul. But there's not a doubt in my mind he's going to be declared a saint at some point. I just hope I'm alive to say it.
Awesome.
How could people get in touch with the Guild if they want to get more information? I know there's a number of books about Father Vincent. Also, there's a movie, that EWTN original movie that they put out, which was good. And there's a lot of information on YouTube.
It's actually the Guild that did the movie.
Oh, okay.
But the deal was that EWTN would get the distribution rights. But James Kelty, who was the director and narrator, the Guild actually put up the money. We raised, that movie was almost $300,000, and we paid like 90% of it. So, but the deal was EWTN would get the distribution, so that's why it reads EWTN. I only say that because I want people to understand, you know, what the Guild is doing, and the Guild pretty much runs on money. The Father Capodanno Guild has two missions. The first mission is to spread the word of Father Capodanno, of his life and his potential for sainthood, and we do that in a lot of ways. We give a lot of presentations. The DVD, that you saw, people have gotten, I think, I don't know how many, thousands of them have gone out. The second piece is, we have to pay for all this. It turns out, if you become a saint, the Vatican doesn't pay for anything. So for the last Italian workman who puts up the last folding chair in St. Peter's Square, we got to pay him and everything else. So, but we do have some upcoming expenses, but they're the two missions. One to spread the word, and two to facilitate the things that have to take place.
Where do our listeners find the Guild? Where do our listeners, where do they find the Guild online? What is it?
Yeah, you go to capodannoguild.org, O-R-G.
Okay.
And on that page, you will find all the biographies of the board members, the history of where we are.
Well, I'll make sure I link to it when we post this on Facebook and YouTube. I'll make sure I put the link in for the Capodanno Guild, and try to spread the word about raising some cash, because that's the world we live in. We need some cash. We want to get things done. So we'll support, obviously, that in any way we can. So we'll link to that, and any other links you want us to put in there, Captain.
That'd be great. But the Capodanno Guild is the website is the best way to get in touch with us. For any size donation, they become supporters of the Guild, and that means they get our quarterly newsletters. If anything significant happens, we put that out immediately. We did that with the miracle. We have this thing called MailChimp, and so we can send all this stuff out at one time pretty quick. We had commissioned, through the generosity of one of our supporters, a portrait of Father Capodanno, and we have a really big size and then a smaller size. But when he was working with Mary Priest and I thought he was going to lose his temper with us, because we kept telling him, if you don't get the eyes right, then the rest of it's a piece of crap. And we had him redo the eyes about, I'd say, a dozen times, until he got it just right. And so now I have one hanging in my bedroom. It's actually, when I wake up, it's the first thing I see. And you can see the eyes are just perfect. The DVDs are on there. And a whole lot of other organizations, other bits of information, how to contact us. There's a number of books, as Joe referred to, that have been written about them. Those accounts are, I'd say, 90% consistent from one to the other, considering the time frames they were written. You know, the Grunt Padre was written in 86. Then along comes the council. They have a tremendous amount more information. The Marines from 3.5, you know, come together in a reunion and more information comes out. So I just, for somebody who was going to read these 3 or 4 books, and some of them like Swift Sword, written by a non-Christian, and talks about basically the war in the Quezon Valley, but talks about this battle as part of it, and Father Capodanno is part of it. So that's a different version, but again, the consistency of the important points is throughout I think there's 5 books now. I've read them all, and that's pretty good because they're coming from diverse sources over 40 years. You know, well, actually, since the 4th one is at 97, 53 years. 53 years ago is when the events took place. So it's pretty amazing, I think. But we really need supporters. We really need people to help us. Because our next, if they come back and make them venerable, we then have to, he's buried in the St. Peter Cemetery in Staten Island. And we then have to exhume the body and bring it to Washington and put it in, an appropriate resting place. The thought right now is that we have a small, not really small, but a chapel room, but it's unfinished and it wasn't designed to hold a casket. We started to do some of the renovations on it, but we'll need a lot more money to make it the kind of place that should be a resting place for a saint. And these, and I'll tell you, so far everything that we've tried to do and had to do, people have stepped up and supported us, and there's never been a day when we didn't have money in the bank account.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, I mean it's pretty good. I never knew I could raise money.
Well, obviously Joe and I will do what we can to spread the word. You know what I mean? To keep reposting this video. Like I said, link to the Capodanno Guild website so people can get the information. Obviously, the most important thing is to read the example of the example that Father Capodanno gave. Okay, so also yes, to support the cause. To throw in a few bucks and support the cause and support you guys in what you're doing. So it's awesome. We
would greatly appreciate that. Because we're looking at some pretty heavy expenses. And again, the first part of our mission, and I tell everybody, and I've told the board, that it's the most important part of our mission, and that is to spread the news of this holy priest, the story of his life. And the money is important, but things like this go a long way towards making the life of this soon-to-be saint known to a much broader audience, more than I could do by giving a presentation. So we really appreciate you all bringing us on Frontline.
Absolutely.
And
well, Captain Phillips, This was an honor. We were educated, Joe Pasillo and myself, by what you have told us and told our listeners. Father Vincent Capodanno is a saint and will become a saint. There is no question in my mind. He served on the front lines. He is an example. That is what a saint is. They are examples to the world. America needs more examples. He will serve as just that now, when we need people like that more than ever. So we want to thank you. Anything we can do to help your guild and your cause and your mission, this is your platform. Anytime you want anything broadcasted, we are most happily at your service. And thank you for your service to the country.
Yes. Thank you also, Captain Phillips.
Okay. Speaking for the Guild, I again want to thank you both for giving us the time to accomplish both our missions, the education piece and raising funds. And you all have been wonderful, and it's been a lot of fun. And again, I thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Captain Phillips. And we want to thank you all for joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo and Joe Resinello. You can catch our show live over the weekend on Facebook Live. Tonight, we're going to be going YouTube Live also. You can follow us on Facebook at the front line with Joe and Joe. Follow us on YouTube at the front line with Joe and Joe. And remember that our conversation, that's your conversation, and that conversation, it's going on everywhere. We'll see you next time.